And of course, um, we have a sizable team that worked on this. Many of them are not perhaps able to make it today, but it's been a great collaboration. So I want to acknowledge everybody involved. Um, like James pointed out at the very beginning, between 2019 and 2024, SPIA was directly involved in running 4 country studies in Ethiopia, Uganda, Vietnam, and Bangladesh. Monica and I were involved especially in the Vietnam effort. And as in all country studies, what we were trying to do was measure rigorously the adoption of CG's innovations in the country. And in Vietnam, we did this by adding survey questions to this official representative household survey called the Vietnam Household Living Standard Survey. And we added questions to the household modules in 2022 and 23, and also to the commune level questionnaire in 2024. Particularly today, we want to talk about the work we did to measure the adoption of this bundle of recommendations for lowland rice cultivation called One Must Do, 5 Reductions, which is a bundle of recommendations that the government put forward. It was developed by ERI in collaboration with ERI, I should say, put forward for sustainable cultivation of rice. And when we think about measuring adoption of a CG innovation, uh, we had to break it down, like Monica is showing right now on the slides, into these 2 pieces. So one is we needed to understand whether the farmers who were growing rice were acting in ways that was consistent with the recommendations in this package. And the other was we needed to know whether or needed to assess whether what they were doing was actually because they were following the recommendation. So was their action due to the recommendation or not? And if both of these pieces we thought we could say yes to, then we would be willing to say that the farmer had adopted the innovation. Now, in each of these pieces, there are challenges. So with the first one, the challenge is what we're calling construct validity, which is when you ask a question in a household survey to a farmer and they answer it, are you actually capturing what it is that farmers are doing? So is it measuring what you're intending to measure? And the second piece is really the challenge of attribution. So if you don't have the sort of classic, like economists typically would use exogenous variation and have a clean identification strategy in order to say if A had caused B. If you didn't have that sort of setup, then can you use just survey questions to capture the information you need to do this causal attribution? So this is sort of broadly speaking the challenges that we faced. I'll show you. Yes. So on the next slide, you can see here, you can start to see all the different dimensions of this 1M5R recommendation package. There are 6 different groups of things that farmers are expected to do. There's a one must do, which is that they must use certified seeds, and then they must reduce the seed rate, the fertilizer use, pesticide use, water use, and also reduce their post-harvest losses. On the next slide, you can see sort of the actual complexity of the package of recommendations. So they're expected to follow all of these things. I'm not expecting you to kind of quickly take this in, but this is more for you to see just how complex the package is, and the fact that there are 2 different levels of criteria, if you like. So there's a strict criterion for each of these, and then there's a lenient criterion. So just as an example, strictly speaking, you should only be using certified seeds, but if you were to take a more lenient view, then a mix of certified and owned seeds was also allowed, and so on and so forth. Some of these are also quite technical. So if you zero in a little bit on the water recommendation, you can see that farmers were supposed to allow their fields to dry down. In the middle of cultivation, but technically they were meant to allow the water to fall 15 centimeters below the surface of the soil, which is not something that's visible to the naked eye, and so would technically have been quite complex for them to meet this criterion. It usually requires the use of other tools and so on. We will, as we go forward, kind of talk about each of these different domains in more detail as Monica explains to you sort of how we dealt with the question of measuring adoption. So on the next slide, I think Monica will start to explain to you the approach that we took.
So I'm going to start by talking about the approach we took in 2022, and then tell you about, how we redesigned questions based on the qualitative work in 2023. And then that's going to be the flow for much of the presentation, this contrast between 2022 and 2023. And where possible, we're going to also be showing you some survey results based on the different ways of asking. So in 20, in 2022, we basically had three yes-no questions, binary questions, and these were the ones. Are you familiar with 1M5R? Have you ever applied it? And have you applied it in the last winter-spring season? Now, we recognize that there were challenges by asking in this way, one being social desirability bias, but also that it does not allow for conditional or partial alternatives. What if somebody applied one part of the package but not the other part? So we also designed domain-specific questions in 2022. These questions were designed based on the expertise that we had in the research team. We knew about the context, we had experience from places elsewhere, understanding rice cultivation and so on. And there were, of course, also some time constraints that happen when you're trying to work with large-scale surveys that are being done nationally. And just to point out that those domain-specific questions in 2022 covered seeds, pesticides, and water. These were the three R's, but we did not attempt questions on two of those R's, which is fertilizer and post-harvest losses. But even with these domain specific questions, some challenges remained. And these were the challenges. So we did not know whether there was different terminology in different provinces, different areas in Vietnam. We did not know how do farmers actually recall and frame their own behaviors. And thirdly, do these survey questions allow for attribution? So we took a slightly different approach in 2023, which was a mixed methods approach. And what we did here is the first level was that we did qualitative open-ended interviews in one province. We conducted 45 in-depth interviews. Of course, we had some structured questions, but largely I would say that they were open-ended, a lot of probing, so that allowed us to understand how farmers talked. We also did inductive coding, which is standard qualitative analysis, which led to the creation of a set of closed-ended survey questions. We then took this and with 160 people across 4 provinces, we did qualitative piloting. And what that meant is that we had these survey structured questionnaires, but we still continued open-ended conversations to understand what worked, what did not, what was confusing, why it was confusing. And the why was a very important part of this kind of conversation. And as you can see in the picture, Tao, one of our co-authors, was conducting one such open-ended conversation with a farmer. And we covered diverse agroecological zones. We went to 4 different provinces. But then we also knew that, having people like Tao, Feng, who are co-authors on this, who did this qual piloting work, that, when you take the field, when you take it to a large representative sample, you still need to make sure that independent enumerators are able to work with that questionnaire. So we also did field testing with 150, and this was done across 6 provinces. And finally, once that was validated, we introduced these new questions in the household survey, living standard survey, which were simple self-reports with these new domain questions. And just to quickly point out the benefit of doing these qualitative interviews and the qualitative piloting, of course, you're centering the farmer's expertise. So the questions really are coming from the bottom up because the approach is that you understand not just what farmers do, but also how they think. You're trying to understand their logic, their rationale, their language, their terminology. And so that when the questions are asked of them, they actually resonate with their own lived experiences. And similarly, with the field testing of the survey module, which was also a very, very important part of this process, we were testing if these questions are actually workable with non-researcher enumerators and that they can be asked across agroecological zones and whether the questions are generalizable. So now moving on to the findings, we have organized it across 3 themes because what the qualitative insights allowed us to do is step back and think about each of these domains differently, like what are similar, what is different across the domains. And so this allowed us to think about, approaching it through these 3 themes, which I'm now going to talk about. The first of the themes is the measurability of embodied technologies. And in this, we have three of those 1M, 5R recommendations, which is the 1M, the 1R, and the 2R. Okay, so let me start by telling our audience what are embodied technologies. So these are innovations that are contained in a tangible input. For example, you can have improved genetics in a seed, you can have nutrients in a fertilizer. And the reason that these are, oops, sorry. Okay, yeah. The reason that this is easier in terms of measurement is because the actual material form of that technology and the physical act that you have of you're actually purchasing the seed, you're handling the seed, you're applying it, this allows for a cognitive anchor for recall. There are 3 recommendations, as I mentioned, that are related to embodied technologies, which then have implications for how to ask these questions and also what is possible to ask in a survey format. And these 3 are the 1M, the use of certified seeds, where it is the improved genetics is in the certified seed itself, and then the seeds and the fertilizer, 1R and 2R. And I'm just going to point out to you what the recommendations are with regards to reducing seed rate or reducing fertilizer. With seed rate, these are the 2 criteria, lenient and strict, 120 kilograms per hectare and 100 per hectare for the strict. And want to point out that with the reduction of the fertilizer, it's about reducing the quantity of nitrogen. So it's one component that we're talking about. And the recommendation is to reduce it to 110 kilogram per hectare for the lenient and 100 per hectare for the strict. And this will have implication, as you will see as we go on. So the first is the use of certified seeds. So the question is, in terms of adoption, are farmers using certified seeds? So in 2022, we had a binary question. Do you use certified seeds? Yes or no? What happened in 2023, based on the qual interviews, we just were able to introduce nuance because farmers told us that they may use certified seeds, they may also use own seeds. So that allowed us to actually develop 4 possibilities in our survey closed-ended responses. Only certified seeds, a combination of certified and own seeds, or only your own seeds, self-produced seeds, or seeds that you get from other farmers, and also the category don't know. So then here are some results to compare across 2022 and 2023. As you can see, in 2022, 85% of farmers said that they had adopted certified seeds, and 15% said that they did not. But because of the nuance that we had introduced through the qualitative interviews, we can now say that 68% of farmers use only certified seeds, whereas 18% use a combination of certified and own seeds. And also the no then gets more complex because 9% say that they only use their own seeds and 5% say that they do not know. So moving on to the first reduction recommendation, which is to reduce seed rate. So the 2 questions are farmers actually reducing seed rates? And can you attribute the change in practice to 1M5R? To harken back to what Sujata has said, the 2 components, in order to see whether we can say something about whether we can trace it back to the actual package. So in 2022, we actually had concerns. Will farmers be able to recall numbers and concerns about numeracy skills. So at that time, our questions in the survey were actually on seeding methods. It was not a direct question about seed rate. So this was an indirect proxy. What 2023 did, the qualitative interviews gave us confidence that actually direct elicitation is possible. So we added questions on what is your current rate, how long have you been using this current rate, and what was your previous rate? And this is the type of interaction that emerged in the qualitative interviews, where a farmer said, I reduced it gradually. First, I reduced the seed rate to 18 kilograms per 1,000 meters square. I saw that this was fine. After that, reduced it further to see how effective it was. So this kind of very clear numeric value that was being given to us in the qualitative interviews told us that, all right, we can ask these very direct questions. So now I'm going to hand over to Sujata, who's going to talk about the survey results from 2023.
Thanks. So what we then did was using the numbers that farmers told us about the seed rate that they were using currently, as well as what they were using previously, we can kind of tabulate something like this table that you're seeing here. And so we're just splitting farmers using the lenient criterion into those that are currently below the 120 threshold, and those that were below the 120 threshold in the past as well, or above that threshold. So what you can see if you look at the rightmost column is currently about 51% of farmers, when I say currently, I mean in 2023, 51% of farmers said that they were using lower than 120 kilogram seed rate, which meant that they were meeting the criterion, the lenient criterion for the 1R recommendation. But then if you look at, well, how many of these farmers were actually above the 120 before, you can see that only about 2.8% of farmers out of the total had moved from a higher seed rate to now below the threshold. So if we wanted to say how much of a change had this recommendation brought about, we can't really say that the majority of the farmers had moved from being non-adopters to adopters. It seems like only 2.8% of farmers had made that shift. Further than using that question that we have about when did you change your seed rate, we can kind of see how many years it's been since they moved from their past rate to their present rate. And you can see 13 years is sort of where we've drawn the vertical line, because 1M5R was first introduced in Vietnam in 2010. And so as of 2023, 13 years would have been the longest that they could have made this shift. You can see that the vast majority of them are answering below 13 years. But what we take away from this is that even though it might look like 51% of farmers were following the 1R recommendation, how many of them could you say had made a change as a result of the new package? It seems like a much smaller percentage based on our survey data. The next point is to look at this 2R, which is the fertilizer use, which Monica will explain.
Thanks, Sujata. So continuing with this idea that fertilizers are also an embodied technology, but a more complex case of embodiment compared to seeds. And let us think about why. So the commonality across seeds and fertilizers are both our physical inputs. They're purchased in known quantities. They're deliberately applied. But unlike seeds, one thing is that fertilizers have a three-part recommendation. So this requires separate measures for the number of applications, the proper timing of those applications, and the quantity of nitrogen in those applications. So just to reiterate, because it is complex, so the number of applications, the recommendations for the lenient is that you should have a minimum of 2 splits, and for the strict, it is a minimum of 3. The measurement challenge is, of course, recall. For appropriate timing, both the lenient and the strict say that it must be between tillering and panicle initiation of the crop growth stage. And then, of course, we have to wonder, okay, how do we ask about this? And the appropriate quantity of nitrogen, that is the complicating factor, because farmers may actually use multi-component fertilizers where nitrogen is only one of those components. And this is where the key asymmetry with seeds comes in, because with seeds, the product is the unit of measurement, but with fertilizer, the nitrogen component must be converted. So not all farmers may know this conversion rate. So, okay, what happened with the questions on number and timing of applications? Just again, as a reminder, we actually did not have questions on fertilizers in 2022. So that's why there is no comparison for this particular recommendation. But what we did in 2023 is we first figured out, okay, what was the design problem? The problem was how to ask about the number and the timing. And the insight was farmers think in crop cycles, not calendar dates. So we had to anchor these questions to crop growth stages. So we used a visual aid, and this is the visual aid we used, which shows these rice growth stages as a show card. Then we created a roster of all the applications. We asked farmers, tell us from the beginning, which is the sowing or transplanting, until you harvest your rice crop, where in this whole stages, give me one by one all the applications that you did for fertilizers. So this was a combination of the roster and the rice growth, stages of rice growth show card. The advantage of this is, of course, it was standardizable across regions. And with this roster and the visual aid, the combination allowed us to capture both the number of applications as well as the timing of those applications. Then the question was how to measure the quantity of the nitrogen in any of these applications. So again, the design problem was how do you measure this when you have multi-component fertilizers? What we realized in the qual insights is actually recall was not the problem. Farmers were actually able to report the fertilizer type, the quantity of and the quantity per land unit with precision, and they used regional area variants that those who know Vietnam very well know the context, know that there are these different land measurement units. So we introduced that into our questions, both in the qual as well as in the survey. And they could also specify actually the NPK ratios for those compound fertilizers. Not everybody, but it was actually not as problematic as we thought it may be. So in the designing of the questions, we asked for the composition, which enabled us to calculate the nitrogen where it was known. And if there was uncertainty, then this got flagged. So this is an example of again, from a qualitative interview where a farmer is telling us, first I used urea fertilizer, this is a single component, nitrogen, 7 kg, and kali, 1 kg, this is a single component, 10 kg the next time, 10 kg of DAP, this is a multi-component, then 10 kg, and then 7 kg for kali, 3 kg for urea. It also depends on the color of the rice. So this kind of detailed explanation by the farmer in the qualitative interview gave us the insight, okay, let's try a closed-ended question and see what happens. The qualitative piloting happened, then we put it into the survey. Okay, what do the survey results tell us about the adoption of 2R? And again, we're looking at the lenient criteria. 82.6% of farmers could actually recall their formula mix for fertilizers. And if you look at adoption rates, this is what we see. So there, again, a reminder, there are 3 recommendations. The first is, did you apply the correct number of applications? 80% of farmers do that. Then you add in, did you apply less than 110 nitrogen, the quantity part per hectare? This drops from 80 to 50. And then you add in whether they applied it at the correct timing, and then the adoption rate drops further to 20%. So this gives us a much more complex picture of adoption of 1R. The next is the second theme, which is the challenge of disembodied technologies. And stay with me, it's a little bit complex. Now we're moving on to pesticides. And what is this challenge? Now, disembodied technologies, why are they disembodied? Because the innovation is a set of design principles. It's about reasoning, it's about principles, it is not an actual physical input. And we will see here that this therefore makes it difficult to measure adoption because the recommendation lives in how the farmer is reasoning whether or not they're going to adopt that recommendation. And 3R comprises three distinct recommendations similar to fertilizer, which is on number, it's on timing, and it's not about the quantity of N like in fertilizers, it's about the trigger, like when should you apply. Okay, in terms of the number, the lenient recommendation is no more than 6 applications. The stricter recommendation actually splits it up and says less than 2 fungicides and less than one insecticide. Now, the measurement challenge here is both recall, language, terminology, appropriate timing, similar to fertilizer. There is a period in which this should take place. No application before panicle initiation or after dose stage, the lenient one. The strict one is slightly different. So again, the question is, how do you ask about timing? And the trigger is also important. No preventive spraying. This is the decision principle. So you apply only if scouting reveals pests, and you avoid any application if the plant can regrow from damages. So the recommendation is living in the reasoning. It's not a tangible product. And the question is, what counts as scouting? What level of potential harm should trigger an application? So here, what the qualitative interviews revealed, again, in 2022, we had a single question. How many times did you apply pesticides, insecticides, and fungicides? And there was no question on timing or trigger. In 2023, one insight was that the farmers use this term pesticides for any agrochemical that includes chemicals to kill weeds, rodents, snails, and which are not part of 3R. 3R is about insecticides and fungicides. So this is an example from an interview where we asked the farmer, in what situation do you decide to spray pesticides? And the farmer in turn asks us, do you want to ask about pesticides on grass or pesticides on pests? So one insight was, okay, let's use this broader term, plant protection drugs, so that we are much more precise in our language. And we redesigned the 2023 survey questions in this way. So first we asked the broad. In the last winter spring season, how many times did you apply plant protection drugs on your main plot, including everything, herbicides, molluscicides, insecticides, fungicides, rodenticides? Because this gives a cognitive anchor for the farmer. Then you ask, of these, how many times did you apply insecticides and fungicides? And then we also ask this additional question, which is, do you normally experience bugs, diseases, or fungus on your main plot? Yes and no, so to get at that reasoning. If you do not experience it, is it because you didn't, if you're not applying, is it because you didn't see a bug, or you actually made a decision to not apply it and do this preventive kind of approach? Very quickly, again, moving to the design problem. One design problem was, okay, how do you separately count fungicides and insecticides? Because they may not know whether they used an insecticide or a fungicide, but they are certainly likely to know what object they were targeting. And so we worked with an entomologist to create a pictorial list of these objects, pictorial lists of pests and diseases. So then the question was, for which object are you using this plant protection drug? And this enabled us to calculate for the strict criteria, whether or not you're using less than one insecticide and less than equal to 2 fungicides. Then the question about timing, we used a similar visual aid that I had shown you earlier, and also did the same roster, similar to the fertilizers. And then the question was about trigger. So we could ask actually the farmer, what was the reasoning behind every application? So this was the question we came up with. What was the purpose of the application? Was it for prevention? Was it for treatment? Or was it for nutrient? And this nutrient was added because sometimes farmers will mix pesticide and fertilizer applications. So this was also a way of checking for that. Okay, I think moving to Sujata.
Yeah, yeah. So we'll show you the results here. We did have data in 22, except in 22 we had just asked about the number of pesticide applications, not knowing at the time that, people are using one term for many things. But in 22, basically 95% of farmers told us that they had applied 6 or fewer pesticide applications, which meant that they would have been just based on, if we were using just that one way to measure it, we would have said they were all following the 3R recommendation. In 2023, we can actually, using the roster that Monica was describing, we can count up and see how many applications they had. And even there, we find basically almost everybody in the survey was answering that they had applied 6 or fewer applications. So just going on this, we would have come up with a very high adoption rate for 3R. But then, since we now have so much more detail, we can break it down further, and we can see that if you add on to that the additional criterion that they applied at the right time, which is not before panicle initiation and not after the dose stage, then the adoption rate falls considerably from nearly 100% to only about 24%. And then if we also additionally add the criterion that it should only be used for treatment and not for prevention, then it falls further to about 16%. So overall, based on what we learned in 2023, we can only really say that 16% of farmers were adopting the 3R recommendation. The next concern is attribution, where Monica will now explain why that was so challenging for this particular case.
We really went back and forth, especially in the qual piloting, because we were doing so well with seed rates. Like, what is going on with pesticide? Why can we not actually attribute this to a particular time? It did not work, and it did not work because there is no discrete moment of adoption for farmers to recall. And that is, again, they will tell us in their own words. So one reason is that pest pressure fluctuates year to year. So they'd say every year there are many types of pests that make me change the pesticides. I have to change because the pest is resistant to the old pesticides. So they have to constantly change their behaviors depending on what they're seeing in the field. And decisions are responding to a fear of crop failure, not to a method or a principle. The only thing I fear the most is sow new, I'm sure I butchered that, which eats the rice stem and the rice panicle gets damaged. We just know if pests are found, we have to take timely action. So it may be more 1 year, less 1 year, but it depends on what they're seeing on the field and the fear of the failure. And that social conformity is continuous, it's not a one time event. If there was a brown plant hopper and other farmers sprayed it, but I didn't, then I would get nothing left to harvest. I would feel ashamed. So this tells us something about why attribution was so difficult, and we did not pursue the same line of questioning that we did for seed rates. So moving on to our third theme, which is a different one, which is a question of structure and agency. And there are two recommendations that come under this. The first one is about reducing water use, and specifically, this is about alternate wetting and drying, AWD. So speaking about something like AWD, it is a disembodied technology. It is a set of actually, sorry, my screen is going okay. It's a set of water management principles that is asking rice farmers to periodically dry their fields rather than keep them continuously flooded. This is an ERI recommendation. I think that a lot of people talk about this, but really the question we have to start with is, does the farmer have agency at all? Because a dry down, which is what the recommendation is, may result from either farmer doing it themselves or their own choice. It could be in the case of Vietnam, where cooperatives are a really important, uh, you know, uh, controller of water use. Is it based on cooperative scheduling, or is it the topography of your land? Because if you're higher level versus lower field, it really makes a difference how the water flows. And without distinguishing whether it is structure or agency or where the choice is coming from, these three pillars, which are these three, we cannot meaningfully measure these. And again, the recommendation on water use are three recommendations bundled into one. One is about the number of dry downs, which is minimum of 2. Another is about depth. So when you do the dry down, how far below do you want the field to dry? And the third is again about timing. So each of these has, attendant measurement challenges with number. Do you recall it? With the dry down level, are you able to translate this very technical threshold into something that the farmer can actually legibly tell us? And of course, how do you ask about the timing question? So in 2022, we had this question, are you familiar with AWD? Have you ever applied AWD? And did you apply it in the last winter spring season? And for each of these, we had a yes, no binary response options. Now in 2023, we took each of these aspects one by one. So starting with the structure agency problem. First, you have to understand, well, who controls the water? Is AWD even possible? So then the redesign question was about, what is the water source? And these were the different water source options that we, learned about in the qualitative work. So we added these different options. Secondly, you can have certain enabling investments which are embodied, which can enable you to better follow the AWD recommendation, which is about laser leveling and water tubes. So we added those. And then we have this question of how many dry downs. This became the entry point into the same roster idea that we had developed for pesticides and fertilizers. How many times did your largest plot dry? And then we had further three more questions asking about when the dry down occurred to figure out the timing, whether it actually matches the AWD recommendation. Then we had again to separate the structure from the agency. What caused each dry down? What was the reason? And the options, I think these are relevant for the quantitative results that we're going to show you. So whether you actively drained it, you meaning the farmer, whether the cooperative drained it, whether they stopped pumping, whether they pump but not enough, topography question, and also a weather-related question. And we tried this. How dry was the field? Ideally, you should be using, water tubes that measure how far below the surface you're able to dry. But it's difficult to do this without some kind of embodied investment. So the best that we came up with is how much did your feet sink when you stepped onto the soil? Okay.
Okay, so the way we'll show the results is actually we're going to classify farmers into three different categories based on how much control we think that the farmers have over the water in their plots. So we've got full control where the farmers own their own water pumps or their own water line. We've got partial control where they own a pump or a sluice, but they still rely on water being released from the reservoir. And then very limited control where they don't own pumps and they can't control when the water is released, but they can have their own dikes, which will prevent water from entering or from exiting their plots. So in the first column, what you see is effectively really 62% of farmers had very limited control over how much water was coming into their fields and so on. And amongst those, if you now go across the columns, then you see that 62% of these 62%, yeah, were doing at least two dry downs. If you added on the criterion that they do it at the right time, it fell to 41%. If you added additionally whether the dry down was intentional, by which we mean really that it was either caused by they themselves or by the cooperative. So we're ruling out those people who say that their field dried down because of the weather or because of their topography. Then it falls to 34%. And then if we add on the criterion that it be at least 5 days long, then it falls to about 22%. And so that's what the last column is showing you. So what you take away from this is really you see among the farmers who have full control over their plots, over the water in their plots, you see about 35% of them have fulfilled all of these four criteria and have met what we would like to say is the criterion, the threshold for doing 4R. But among the farmers with very limited control, it's about 22%. So there is some correlation. It's not a linear correlation between how much control the farmers have and whether they adopt the 4R recommendation or not. But I think one way to think about this, and of course it's not causal. I should definitely mention that. But we do think that when the control is shared is when we see the least adoption, but when either the farmer has a lot of control. So when the farmer has full control, we see a fairly high adoption rate of 35%, but when the cooperative has a lot more control, then also we see a moderate level of adoption. So there is some belief, I think, in Vietnam that cooperatives should make it easier for the AWD recommendation to be adopted. And there is something here that suggests that maybe some of that is going on. Um, the next recommendation under the theme 3 is the post-harvest losses.
Do we still have time to go through this, or should we move things along?
Yeah, I think it'd be good to keep 10 minutes for questions then if you can
Yeah,
maybe
yeah.
just
We'll
try
move.
to
Yeah, yeah.
move
I'll make it
conclude in the
quick.
next five, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
I mean, similar idea. Now you get the drift. So we had 2022 questions that asked about, what is the method that you use for harvesting? And these were the options. These were an embodied technologies, not an agronomic decision. And we did not have any questions for drying or storage because post-harvest losses includes three things: harvesting, drying, and storage. So again, from the design problem to the qual insight to the questions that we were asking, and I want to focus really on the next slide, but I just want to point out here that based on what we were hearing in the field, we were able to ask about the harvest timing and also about the harvesting method and how long they had been using this harvesting method. But here I want to point out the few things that are in bold because the question is how to measure drying. Now, this is where the structure agency again comes in. In the Mekong Delta, at least, farmers are selling wet rice or fresh rice immediately after the rice is grown. So drying is actually outside their control. And what we did what we were hearing in the field in our interviews is the way that farmers assess dryness is through biting the grain and listening for the sound. So we knew we had to add this question on. It's not part of the recommendation exactly, but it is what farmers do. So we added this question. And finally, again, with storage, when farmers retain the rice, the back type is known and easily reportable. But we did add this question is of, we don't store because we sell fresh rice. So again, allowing for questions on structure and agency to be built into the survey module was an important part of this 5R reduction of post-harvest losses. Okay, Sujata.
So I'll just show you the table. If you click the table and show it to us, yeah. So what you see now is 10% of the farmers roughly are just selling their rice wet or fresh. And so the questions about drying and storage don't apply to them. So there was no, just the design of the question and now didn't even ask them those questions. But among the 90% who did dry their own rice, you can see 60% of them were using combined harvesters, but then when it came to the timing, you can see how the percentage fell to only about 15% of farmers were doing both the combined harvesters and the correct timing. And then almost nobody was using machines, and nobody absolutely was storing it according to the recommendations. So the takeaway from the 5R really is we found almost no adoption given just how much technology, additional embodied technology they would have had to use in order to make it work. So now the last thing we want to talk about is just overall, what did we learn about adoption rates? So in 2022, on the next slide, the first thing that we show you is just using the simple question, are you aware of 1M5R? Did you apply it? We see, 5% of farmers, 5.5% of farmers saying they're aware of it, and 3% saying that they had applied it. We can also use the domain specific questions to build up, if you like, construct what the estimates were based on what farmers were in fact doing. We can only do it for these three because that's the only things we ask questions about. You can see 85% of farmers were following 1M in that they said they were using certified seeds. If you add on the pesticide reduction recommendation next, on the next slide, then you can see, sorry, on that same slide, I'm sorry, then you can see 95% were, they had the right number of pesticide applications. And so the intersection set is only 81%. You add on the 4R, it falls to 38%. And then you can see how many of the people on the final picture, how many of the people who said on the left hand side that the 3% who said they were applying 1M5R, how many of them were doing sort of 1M3R, 4R? And you can see 2%. So two-thirds of them were actually following at least these three recommendations, but 1% wasn't even doing that. On the next slide, you can see 2023, where we now have a much more complete picture of how much 1M5R is being adopted. So 86% of farmers are using certified seeds. When we add on those that are also following the seed rate recommendation, the intersection set now falls to 62%. When we add on the nitrogen or the fertilizer recommendation, it falls to 16%. So that's quite a dramatic fall. And then you can add on each additional one. And by the end of it, I'm sure you could have guessed that since nobody was doing 5R, really, when you look at the intersection set of who's doing all of these different things, there's almost nobody in the sample that is doing that. So I'll just quickly conclude with sort of what we think we learned from this. So I think one thing that Monica has pointed out several times to us is that as quantitative researchers, we tend to think of qualitative work as something that adds something extra. It adds what she calls texture or color, or what I might call sort of it adds richness to your understanding. But in this particular project, given the research question that we were looking at and the context in which we were looking at it, we really had to use what she calls a truly mixed methods approach to measure adoption. So we had to develop new survey questions that could reliably capture what farmers were doing, but also design them in a way that could allow us to assess whether the actions could be attributed to the recommendations. We may have worried before we did the qualitative work that there were questions that we just couldn't ask because farmers didn't have the numeracy skills or they didn't have the memory to be able to tell us some of these things. But in fact, we learned that farmers were quite sophisticated, and they helped us understand what types of questions we could reliably ask and in which domains. But we also learned that every domain is different. And so sometimes we had to grapple with the principles that were underlying the recommendations and how they kind of bump up against the realities of what farmers are doing. And especially that was a problem when it came to recommendations that were contingent, when it wasn't enough just to understand what farmers had actually done in that previous growing season, but what they would have done if the state of the world had been different. And to ask those types of counterfactual questions turned out to be quite difficult in a large scale survey context. And so that also highlights, if you like, some of the limits of how much we can achieve through just self-report survey questions. That's all we have. And thank you very much. We'll be really happy to take questions.
Yeah. Thanks, Sujata. Monica, Paul, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, thank you very much for these insights. It was a pleasure to learn about your experiences. I am working at the Center for Development Research in Bonn in the continuing these Vietnam country studies as a PhD candidate. And I'm working on AWD, and I would be really interested in both your results and methods. So one thing was that the adoption numbers you reported here were higher than the one in the report. So I would be happy on some clarification there. I think in the report it was around 3 to 5%, depending on 1 or 2 dry downs. And then on the method, I would be really interested in your experience on how do you think was the farmers' recall on precise AWD? So how often did they really check their fields? I think you used a threshold of 5 days to approximate for these 15 centimeter. Do you think that was accurate? Did you do qualitative interviews on that? Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Let me collect a few. Monica, Sujata, if you're able to keep track, I'll let Jonas and then Robert.
Thank you. Thank you. Both very nice presentation. It was very helpful. I'm working with the Nigeria team. So we're preparing to go to the field. So this is very useful. 2 questions that I wanted to ask. One is on the qualitative open-ended questions to understand adoption stories. I mean, I used qualitative questions in RCTs to understand mechanisms, but it is not really open-ended. Now we have like 5,000 households and we want to cover, and I wonder how we would incorporate, I would make it manageable to include qualitative questions. Is there any way of simplifying that, or do we take a subsample of those 5,000 households? The second quick one is on the question on seed, certified seed. Very often farmers can tell you they use certified seeds, but there is measurement issue here. I mean, in the standard sense, we do DNA fingerprinting to make sure that they indeed used modern seeds or improved seeds. But when it comes to certification, sometimes those individuals that are selling these as certified seed are not really selling certified seeds. So is there any direct way of verifying that information in your case, in addition to, DNA fingerprinting, for example, by going to the seed distributors, etc. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonas. And let's take Robert, and then I'll have Monica, Sujata, and then we'll do another round.
Yeah, thank you very much, Monica and Sujata. Certainly very, very interesting work. I'll just be reflecting on the external validity of these results. And I'm asking this in the context of the typical smallholder farmer, say in Africa, or well, probably Ghana or Burkina Faso or Niger, that I probably have a bit of experience with. And because the sort of capacity of these smallholder farmers in not only recalling, but also in being sure about the measurements. Some of these measurements, sometimes I think the variation can be quite large in some of the cases. So I just wanted some reflection of what in the Vietnam case, the typical characteristics of these farmers. And again, just a footnote to that is that so for one of the areas that typically you find quite some variation is, say, the size of the land, right? So they might be, if you think of your 1R, they might be able to reflect on the seeds that are used, but the area planted, sometimes there is variation. If you do compare what they report with, say, GPS measurements of the land that they were supposed to have cultivated. So I just wanted some reflections on all these, the characteristics of these farmers. But otherwise, I think this is very useful and insightful in getting us to think more deeply about the use of quant in our research. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. Okay, Monica, Sujata, do you want to take those three from Paul, Jonas, and Robert, and then we'll have one more round before we close.
Sure. So I think Monica will answer better than I will. Let me first address. So I wrote them down. So Paul is asking about the adoption rate in the SPIA report for AWD. I need to go back and check. I don't want to just answer off the cuff. So I can definitely get back to you on that, Paul. It could be that we've used, we've been using additional criteria here, which may not have been used back then when we were developing the report. Monica, can you say anything about how often they checked? So when we measured dry down length to 5 days.
Yeah, we did not actually have a question on how often they checked. So yeah, the answer.
Yeah, so it is self-reported. It is self-reported how many days they allowed the water to dry down for. How should they add qualitative in Nigeria to a sample of 5,000 households?
So yeah, this is actually a really good question because it comes up a lot, like how many interviews? I think if I had to boil it down to, I think if I'm understanding this right, Jonas, you're like, okay, how many interviews do you need in order to be able to build this? And the Vietnam example was we did 45 interviews, and 45 interviews, then when we coded them up, we started seeing saturation at about 20 interviews. Now, that was not enough because we had to do the qual piloting. I cannot emphasize that enough. That second stage of qual piloting, of talking to 160 farmers across the agroecological zones, allowed further refinement, which was a very, very important part. So stage 1, 45 interviews, 20 coded, gave us one set, 160 interviews, again done by people, and I cannot again emphasize this enough, researchers trained in doing good qualitative interviews. I have to thank Fang. I don't know if she's here, but if she's here, shout out to her, shout out to Tao, who did an excellent job in making sure that we were asking the right level of questions and asking the probes to get to that. I hope I answered that, Eunice.
So I think your second question was about sort of seeds that are being sold as certified but are actually fake. I don't think that was necessarily a concern in Vietnam, but broader, I mean, I'm sure I'm not saying anything that you haven't thought about, which is, we have in other contexts sort of gone and tried to take photographs of different brands and so on and so forth that are being sold in the shops so that farmers can then, similar to this show card business that we had here or the pictorial list, then they could map and they could tell us this is the brand that I bought and that is the brand that I bought and so on. So I imagine some method like that might be useful when you can't be sure that what they're saying is certified is actually certified. To answer Robert's question about measurement accuracy and particularly with respect to land size. So I think this might again be a Vietnamese thing where every farmer has documents on what the size of their plots are, and so we didn't have to worry that much in Vietnam that they were not going to be able to tell us how much land they have or that they were giving us the wrong numbers. But you're absolutely right. So I think contexts vary tremendously, and one has to design the survey questions that are appropriate for one's own context, which I think Monica would argue is a really important reason why the qualitative is so important, because I think in 2022 we did go in thinking farmers would not have skills, would not be able to answer questions about certain numbers, and then through the qualitative we found out that they could, right? And
Yeah,
so
and part of the researcher expertise coming from probably places where recall is really, really hard made us think that probably farmers cannot answer it in Vietnam. But when we're like, okay, they can. And so something similar can be done in countries, and to figure out like what can be asked, what level of detail can be asked, how do people do measure in some way. So what are those ways of measuring? Yeah.
Yeah.
But the point is well taken. Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
And Paul and Eunice. Yeah.
Okay, we're at time, but I see several hands raised, so I do want to allow us to go over a little bit. If folks need to drop off, please do so. But I want to just quickly address two questions from the chat. Guy, I think I can answer your question about do we have an estimate of how much these practices in the bundle contribute to final yield? We don't causally, because we don't have random assignment here. So the concern there would be we could certainly report the yields of farmers in these different groups according to the intersection sets that Sujata presented, but obviously that would be kind of endogenous to the characteristics of the farmer. And so, we can certainly look at that, and that would be interesting, but it would certainly not specifically address your question of how much the practices contribute. We could just report on average what the yields are for people that are following those practices. And yeah, and then the later question from Tan is, yeah, again, kind of around the definition of adoption. I take this more of a comment and maybe an open-ended comment. I don't think, and we need Monica and Sujata to react to that, but we can certainly reflect on that as an authorship group, and a point well made. I think it's just a question of different perspectives there. So let me invite the three hands I still see raised, Tran Vu and Sohel and Adebayo, to ask one final round of questions.
Hello, thank you. This is Chang from Vietnam. I'm looking at ERI on the adoption of low emission technologies, and I'm very excited to see this research. It's a very thorough, multi-phase research that you've done. Congratulations, and I sure learned a lot from these insights. I have a few questions regarding water management. And I might have missed the first part where the recommendation, where the reference of the recommendation for 1M5R was mentioned, maybe. But can you tell me again which document or material do you have for referencing these recommendations for 1M5R? Because the recommendation of drying for 5 days seems a little bit strange to me. We normally consider 3 days instead of 5 days. So that is very interesting to figure out. And the second question is, do you think it is important to identify the structure versus the agency in terms of water management? Because once, from the perspective of greenhouse gas reduction, once it's dry, then the reduction has been achieved. So whether it's because the farmer controls it or if the cooperative controls it, does it make a difference? That's my question. Thank you.
I think on the question of does it matter whether it was the cooperative or the farmer in terms of the greenhouse gas reductions, I think you're absolutely right. I think there's still research to be done that shows that in the field when farmers are doing AWD, greenhouse gases are falling. I'm not sure that that research has been done in sort of farmer fields as opposed to sort of field trials. But I don't think it matters. But I think if the water is drying down, like for example, in the Bangladesh country study, sometimes fields were dry, not because anybody had tried to reduce the amount of water in the field, but because it was just so hot. And so I think then to say that that was, you wouldn't want to attribute that to AWD. So I think understanding if it's human control versus nature causing the dry down, I think is important. On your question of the manual, I will have to find out which I don't know the name of the official recommendations book that we are looking at, but I do know that it is a book in Vietnamese that we are relying on. I can check that and get back to you.
Thank you.
Great. Sahel.
Great. Thank you for this very nice presentation. So I'm Sohel from CEF Unibon, and sorry I could not follow the slides from my side. I think it was only from my side. That's why I did not disrupt the presentation, but I was mostly listening to you. One at a place where I got lost was this cooperative into this AWD. Sorry for asking a lot of questions around AWD. But it somehow goes with a Trang's question. So you see, for the one of the major barrier for this AWD adoption could be this area-based flat tariff irrigation system, right? Now, what we did some expert interviews in Vietnam, and we could know that this cooperative who are nowadays being supported under the different institutional promotions like VNSAT or like 1 million hectare, these cooperatives, they try to, they help adding modest pumping cost through negotiated pumping pricing for a season, which again is a modest incentives for farmers to reduce the number of pumping, and that's why that's why the adoption of AWT. So, but I couldn't really follow what was your findings because I couldn't see the slides. Maybe I would just like to know maybe one sentence, not verdict, but comment what role you found for cooperatives in either facilitating or discouraging this AWD adoption. Sorry for taking a lot of time, but that's all. Thanks.
Monica, do you remember anything from the qualitative work about the role that co-ops were playing?
I think from just looking at even the survey data results, right? What we found is that when cooperatives play a role, when farmers have very limited control, it's a higher rate of adoption than when farmers have partial control. Higher meaning, a lower rate of control is because cooperatives are playing a more important role rather than personal individual decision. So I don't know if that answers your question, Sohel, but maybe we can take this up given we're a little over time. Happy to answer questions on email too.
Okay. Let's take the last question from Adebayo.
I'm sorry again. I think time is of essence, but I think the methodology kind of uncover the need for us doing this innovation science to get feedback from farmers in order to be able to help us. I mean, this is my own level of understanding, that better understand what is the nuances that the farmers do have before we can better prepare innovation that will suit them. I mean, that's just my first thought, because this unpack a lot of things in terms of how we better understand what their situation is in order to be able to adopt the technology. Because if we are providing technology and we don't seem to understand their own situation, how then would they be able to adopt it? That's one of the things that I hear from here. But the other thing is, what does this say about the package right now? Because conclusion, I mean, inferences that we're drawing is that as we dig deep, less possibility of adoption is coming up. So what else can we now do about this? How do we now deal with this recommendation that already been provided, and how do we improve on it? And then the last part is, I see maybe would it be that there's a challenge with respect to introducing relevant questions into the survey that could have helped us to be able to draw better feedback from the respondents. Maybe because there's might be kind of constraint in the integration of some questions into the surveys, that might be a challenge. I don't know whether you have that kind of feeling, and how it would have been useful if you have designed your own set of questions to be able to better elicit information from the farmers. Thank you.
I'm not sure I understood the last question, but to the second question, or the second point you made, I mean, I think one way to think about this is you could think of 1M5R as sort of just aspirational, right? So the government would like to see, the Ministry of Agriculture would like to see all of these 6 things happening. But there are some just very hard structural constraints. So if you look at 5R, for example, if the recommendation is that you must use machines to dry your rice, but machines do not exist in, the private sector or the public sector does not, the markets don't exist for this, then it's just not going to happen. And so, it could just be that some of these recommendations, there is really no hope that people will fully be able to adopt all of them, but this is something towards which the country would like to move. That could be a way of thinking about it. So just because we find 0% in aggregate doesn't mean that all is, it's a completely dismal story, because you see very high adoption rates, at least for some of them. I think that's one way to think about it. And I'm sorry, I didn't understand the last question, because we did design our own survey questions for these things.
Yeah, no, the point I wanted to make there is how much convenient were you able to have, would you have been able to introduce as much as many questions into the survey? Because I know most of the surveys are constraints, in terms of the quantity, and because of the length and the time and so on, all the resources required to deliver. Would it have been that maybe you would have wanted to ask more questions that were to, but because of the constraints of the system that allows very in targeted number of questions to be in the survey question, that may be limited, that was the question I was trying to read again.
I see.
I
So
think a
Monica,
shout
yeah.
out to Frederick for that, because really it's about relationship building that happened in country with GSO. This had nothing to do with certainly me. I had never even met anybody, but it's James, it's Frederick, it's that's what enabled the addition of those questions, right, James? I mean, it's fair to
Yeah, I
say.
mean, we were told this would be impossible to do in Vietnam when we started this thing. So yeah, very much echo what Monica's saying here, that it's about building trust and relationship with institutions, and that takes time, takes physical presence, commitment, all that stuff. Yeah, so definitely shout out to Frederick and the team that allowed this to happen. Good. we should wrap up. This has been great, very satisfying to see these results presented in this way from both of you. Thank you very much. Thank you all for your questions. We can certainly share the slides, and we are ready to help kind of broker connections, advice through our team to this sort of body of work, this literature more generally. So please don't hesitate to reach out to SPIA if you have questions about how you want to try to tackle using some of the approaches that may be new to you that you've heard about today. Thank you to our speakers. Monica, Sujata is excellent, and thank you all for your interest and questions, and look forward to seeing you all again in a future webinar. Thanks.
Yes,
Thank
thank you,
you.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye.